So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to have us here in your seminar. It's a really pleasure for me to introduce you Dr. Estelle. She's from Hope College in Michigan in USA. She's an associate professor, and if you don't mind, I will read her biography so you know what her research program is. So, Dr. Estelle is an associate professor of economics at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and a research fellow of the Acton Institute, a think tank that integrates the ideas of religion and liberty. She's also the founding director of Hope's College Markets and Morality program, which invites students to explore economic issues, and through a Christian lens, and brings speakers and film screenings to campus to enrich the Hope's community's understanding of markets. In addition to her work with students, Dr. Estelle conducts applied microeconomic research on topics including parenting, investments, higher education, welfare policy, and criminal justice reform, for which she has been recognized as a Rouge Faculty Fellow. Currently, she is researching different conceptions of the role of the state through projects that bridge economic ideas with traditional Christian theology. Dr. Estelle earned her PhD in economics at the University of Virginia. So today's topic is Friedrich von Hayek, a famous person from Austrian economic school of thought. And I'm really excited to hear about Hayek, and he's a great person and Nobel Prize winner. And Sarah, she's now on the sabbatical. She spent a few days in Vienna researching on Hayek, so I think she's the most interesting person to bring us the ideas that she has learned. So I will give you the word, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. It is a real pleasure to be here with you to talk about this very interesting man, scholar, I'd say keen observer, Friedrich Hayek. First, I want to invite you to ask questions, make comments at any point while I'm talking. I think that is helpful to have more of a discussion, if that's okay with you in your seminar. It allows you to signal to me what you're finding most interesting, or maybe what you want to push back on, or kind of dispute. I think that can be very productive, so please feel free to insert yourself. It won't be interrupting. I would appreciate it. Also, please feel free to interrupt me if I start talking too quickly. I don't know, I suspect all of you, when you're in front of a group of people, can find yourself getting excited about things you're talking about and maybe moving at a too quick of a pace to, again, invite that conversation. So I want you to know that I am aware that I can be a fast talker, and maybe that's not good when we're what is likely to be a new topic, or maybe a rusty, as we might say, topic, something we might have thought about in years past, the work of Friedrich Hayek. In my graduate training, I can't say that anyone ever mentioned him to me. I knew of him because of my undergraduate work. But my graduate work was very technical, and my research agenda for most of my career thus far has been very technical, and I think that's all very good, and I've been able to do some interesting things, and I enjoy that. But then as my career has progressed, I've decided that I like this idea of more of a dual agenda, where I can more fully, I think in a way that's consistent with the life of the mind and scholarly work, explore things that I find interesting, with less of a concern of whether it's going to end up in, Econometrica or the American Economic Review or some, super high-level journal that, if it's a good idea, it deserves an audience. And so that's what's brought me to studying Hayek more. And I have just spent a number of days in Vienna, and this sabbatical period that I have is really focused on extending my research agenda to the work that he has done over the course of his life and what that has to say to us today. So again, it's my expectation that most of us perhaps aren't even really familiar with Hayek beyond the fact that he won a Nobel Prize at some point. and that certainly most of us aren't thinking about him on a regular basis, just because of the particularities for the economists among us, right, of our field and what it values these days and the way we think about things, that we don't always look back at these great thinkers and understand that they still speak to us today. So I want to start just by introducing F.A. Hayek, putting him in context of history, right? He was born in 1899 in Vienna. He was there through the interwar period, but come 1930s, a number of scholars, right, were voluntarily, in his case, leaving, not just because of the political tensions and the like, but actually it was very difficult for scholars in Vienna to get faculty positions. His mentor, for example, Ludwig von Mises, in particular, very productive, but was a Jewish scholar and had difficulty right, finding a place in a university, and that led to some uncertainty of career trajectory and what that would look like. And so he left for the London School of Economics. He spent time there. He moved to the University of Chicago. He was at then University of Freiburg, and then Salzburg, and then back to Freiburg. And so he moved around a good bit. And I think that probably has a benefit to us more broadly, that he made his way throughout different regions of the world and had his voice in a lot of different places. Although I think it was challenging for him, and at times I think his career was discouraging, because his perspective on things was falling out of fashion, and he wasn't recognized consistently as a quote-unquote economist, because he wasn't constantly doing this highly technical, scientific, right, work that was coming into fashion. But he was really quite productive. He's oftentimes referred to as a member of the Austrian School of Economics. I think that's accurate just based on the time period in which he was formed. That's reflected in his perspective. But he's, I would say, most likely the most famous member of the Austrian School of Economics, and appreciated more broadly than maybe some of the other members. And certainly they're all great scholars, and so have nuanced thinking and differences. So to put them under an umbrella, I think, isn't always necessarily the best way to go, but it does give us some sense of the time and the place that he was shaped in. Fortunately, although his career was challenging at points, and I think he took it rather personally, that his foil, John Maynard Keynes, came into such fashion and he fell out of fashion, he found some encouragement in winning, of course, who wouldn't, the Nobel Prize, right? So when he won the Nobel Prize, that kind of gave him some new energy, and we see that there was a great deal of productivity in his work later in his career, and I'm grateful for that, and that he found at the end of his life that his ideas were valued by other people. So he's done so much. I wanted to kind of represent the sorts of work he's done, defining it across multiple dimensions. So kind of in the horizontal space, thinking about the topical scope of his work. He is well known for his macroeconomic technical work, business cycles, and monetary policy, monetary theory. In fact, his Nobel Prize recognized him for this, but also for what we'll talk about in a moment, his reflections on local knowledge and the use of information, and how the price system makes particularly good use of dispersed information. And so I would categorize that more as microeconomics, really getting to the core of things. And when he was doing this work, it wasn't always apparent, I think it was to the members of the Austrian school, but not economics as a discipline more broadly, that macro should actually reflect micro. That, you know, I think we've come to an understanding that, or somewhat of a consensus in our discipline, that macroeconomics should reflect microeconomic underpinnings. He really was just spreading himself through these topics because he thought there were interesting things to be said there, and of course he didn't see that there was such a dichotomy. So topically, I am most interested in his microeconomic work, in part because I myself am a microeconomist. But I also think that it doesn't get as much attention, maybe because he doesn't have that obvious foil of John Maynard Keynes, right? There's something about debates that capture people's attention, and so we maybe think of him more as a macroeconomist, although he had much to offer there. Then in the vertical space, I wanted to reflect the fact that early in his career, he was engaged in more technical work, even more technical economic theory. And then as he went through his career, he branched out into political economy and social philosophy and even kind of cognitive, evolutionary, like psychology of sorts. And I think that was something that changed over the course of his career, but you can see the roots of it in his experience in Vienna. That the life of the mind in Vienna was one where people did not, in the interwar period, did not put constraints on, I'm an economist, I meet with economists, we talk about economics, right? They weren't so concerned about putting boxes on things, but really could discuss more broadly in a group of scholars and found that a very helpful way to think about our civilization. And so in his writing, he started to do that more later in his career. And although I do most of my work in technical economics, again, here is where I find myself most drawn to Hayek, is the bigger picture that he can provide us. And so I would say my comments today are going to fall at the intersection of more microeconomics and then these big ideas that help us understand the context that our civilization provides. It's not that it's separate from technical economics, but I do see it as providing kind of a backdrop and a broader understanding within which markets and economic systems, right, operate. In the end, I just think Hayek, there's something in here, I hope, for everyone, and that he has been so prolific, and he is such a keen observer across so many different dimensions of our civilization and the environment within which our economics operate. So that was somewhat of a long introduction, but I want to tell you what I'd like to do with the rest of our time. First, I would like to share with you what I think are three really helpful contributions of his work. Some of this may be review. Some of this might be even something we've heard a number of times, understand, maybe agree with, maybe disagree with, which is fine. But we didn't know it came from Hayek, or that Hayek had a particular perspective on it. I always find that interesting. There are things in this list I would say show up in the first chapter of the textbook I use with my introductory students, and I think it's very interesting that some of his perspectives have become somewhat consensus in mainstream economics. Then I'd like to put this in context of what this means for us today, in particular how it inspires contemporary scholarship, and maybe how it speaks to some of the current day issues we're having in society. And then if we have time, I might have a few moments to tell you how I'm bridging Hayek's observations with some different models of morality. In particular, I've been looking at traditional theological perspectives, and I find it really interesting that he, as an agnostic, observes reality around him in a way that is quite congruent and harmonious with some very faith-based approaches. And I always find that as a scholar really encouraging when people starting from different premises and with different objectives come to understand things in a similar way. It points us in the direction of some, I think, kind of truth that multiple people can come to similar conclusions. And so that's been driving my research with Hayek. So let's start then with the observations. And you've probably noticed on some of the publicity materials I noted that we would talk about as non-monetary contributions, not because they're unimportant, but because I think that does already get some play. In fact, if I was to ask one of my students or a group of my students whether they're familiar with Friedrich Hayek, they would probably say no, especially before my class. But if they did, they would know him for this. And I want to offer some graphics. Has anyone seen? Yeah, I mean, he's a great rapper, right? This is a really popular YouTube video where Hayek, represented on the right in the video, and Keynes here in the foreground on the left, very accurately debate through rap monetary policy and macroeconomic agenda. And it's really good. It's a very well-made video. I would say there's one thing that's inaccurate. I think Hayek had more hair than Keynes for most of his life, so I don't know how they chose the actors, but otherwise the economics is very good. And so my students might know it for this, and if you have any students you think would be interested or that you want to kind of get excited about economics, macroeconomics, monetary policy, I would encourage you to send them this video because it's pretty cool. Yeah, Fear the Boom and Bust is the name of the video, so you can find that on YouTube. So we already have this insight on what he's thinking about macroeconomics. I want to push us more, my students, other scholars like you that I engage with, to think about the micro piece of things, the other part of his work that he was recognized for in his Nobel Prize, the basics of the price system and dispersed knowledge and how important it is to think about economic systems in light of what they allow us to do with our information. And so if we're not familiar with the video, perhaps we'll know him for his popular book, The Road to Serfdom. It's interesting in that it is a book written by an economist that's, number one, popular. That doesn't happen too much, right? Popular in a broader audience. And it's not become unpopular at any point, but there are points in time when it becomes very popular, like it's a bestseller on Amazon, or someone mentions it on television and everyone's buying it again. And so some folks will know him for this book. I read it again over the summer, and I couldn't help but think, even though he's writing this in the early 40s from London, looking at his experience in Vienna, what he saw happening with civilization there, seeking to warn England that they were on the same sort of path. But even as I read that book in the summer of 2018, that there were a lot of things he said that sounded like things that I see happening where I sit at this point in time in the United States. And I think in my last couple of weeks in Europe, I think we see some analogies as well in different political situations throughout the continent. So I find it a really helpful book. If we want to start with something small, kind of content dense and rich, something to recommend to graduate students, or if you happen to run into Hayek during your graduate training, again, I didn't. This is probably the article that you would have read, and I recommend it highly, especially to scholars or advanced students, and that's his reflections on the use of knowledge in society. And this is what I'm going to draw on to start with in terms of just some of his very valuable contributions. While I've been in Europe, actually, my reading group, Markets and Morality, that Yvonne referenced, they discussed this article with one of my colleagues. It was one of the things I had to keep them busy while I was gone, and so they can engage with this argument as well. But I think there's a lot here for scholars like us to dig into. So the first observation is that we live in a complex world characterized by dispersed knowledge. Knowledge is local. That makes for a complex world. So when we think about the economic problem, we think about scarce resources, we think about how do we allocate them to achieve the best we can. He starts this article, The Use of Knowledge in Society, with this quote here, pointing out that this is a really simple problem if, just three things, right? If we possess all of the relevant information, if we can start out from a given system of preferences, and if we command complete knowledge of available means, right? He says then the problem remains purely one of logic, right? Easy. That's why all of us have such an easy job as economists, because of course we have all these things. No, we have none of these things, right? We don't possess all of the available information or the knowledge as to how to use it. And we certainly don't know everyone's preferences. And mathematically, he wouldn't say it this way. He's not always as great a fan of using mathematics and economics. But I would say as a more mathematical economist, it's a really hard question, even if we did have everyone's individual preferences, right, to put them all together into something like a social welfare function. So the problem is complex. And I think this is helpful for a number of reasons to reflect on. Just one that pops to mind is, as our society becomes more, and our world becomes more globalized, we have more technology, we have people reflecting on just how complex things are becoming, Hayek would actually argue that as soon as we stepped out of our kind of prehistoric tribal family unit and started exchanging with other people that we didn't have those sorts of familial ties with, things got complex, right? That we don't know and understand the preferences and the abilities and the resources that are available in people outside of our narrow unit. And so I like this part of Hayek for the fact that it causes us to think it's not just because we're on this, it seems like, race to technological improvement. It's actually our society is complex, our world is complex from the beginning, as soon as we step outside of our family. And it is complex, as I mentioned, in large part because knowledge is local. He says in this article that it is particular to time and place. Not only that, but it's emerging. It doesn't just, knowledge doesn't just sit somewhere else in the world and it's kind of there for us to take. We actually have to discover it. In fact, he's going to judge economic systems. His main criterion that he uses in this article is the best economic system is the one that makes the fullest use of information and knowledge. That is his chief criterion. He is well known to be a fan of freedom and liberty, but he doesn't say the best system is one that gives freedom. Right? That's kind of a result of his analysis. He says it's the one that makes the best use of this knowledge that is dispersed. It should be clear when he talks about knowledge too, he doesn't just mean facts. It's not a perfect synonym for information, and it's certainly not just about scientific facts. When he wrote this in the 1940s, he was already seeing that our discipline and others were becoming not just scientific, but kind of approaching scientism, right? That truth is only found in the scientific facts, and we've achieved much in terms of our scientific method that we can just know these things so easily and then make use of it in terms of planning the economy. And he wants to make clear that knowledge is something more than information. It's a certain amount of wisdom and insight and perspective that allows us to use the information. I think it's so important today when we see big data, right, and these amazing systems that I can't really comprehend about how data is exchanged over continents, and in these infinitesimally small amounts of time you can communicate something really valuable. But still, that's information, not necessarily knowledge, right? You need the context, the perspective, and knowledge is local. He would say it's essentially dispersed. Knowledge is essentially dispersed. And I had a philosopher tell me that essentially dispersed, that's a very strong claim. That means it's inherently, it will always be. It is by its existence, right? Essentially dispersed. So no matter how big our data gets, no matter how good our technology and communication infrastructure gets, knowledge will be local. And that makes me think that this contribution of Hayek is never going to get old and dusty. We'll probably want to continually reflect on what that means. If you're curious, this painting here is in Vienna. I just saw it the other day. I thought it was neat. It's a fruit market. I think it's fun to think about how markets have changed over time, but in what ways they haven't either. There's local information. about growing fruit. There's local information about where to buy fruit, right? There is all sorts of information that is communicated even in the price of an apple. That it's hard to imagine then all of the information and knowledge throughout a particular market, let alone the whole market system, being able to be communicated in a way that is useful to a central planner. And so that's the second observation is he's really a fan of the price system. Again, for what it does, what it allows us to do with dispersed information. And of course, he's well known for arguing against central planning for the fact that it doesn't allow us to make the fullest use of the knowledge available. To be clear, he's not opposed to planning. In the use of knowledge in society, he says all action involves planning. We all plan to be here today. That's how we ended up here. Although I doubt there was very much central planning in that. There was certainly very good publicity, thank you, Yvonne. But right, no one was manipulating you to get you here in some specific way. You had your breakfast and got dressed and did these things with some planning. And so he says all human action requires planning, but it's where does the planning happen? Right? And so he's a fan of the price system. He appreciates the price system because of this basic argument he outlines in his article based on this essentially dispersed knowledge. Right? So he would argue that if knowledge is local, and he claims that it is, and sound decision making requires much but diffused information, right? All sorts of our decisions require a lot of information that we might not have at our fingertips. Then decision making needs to be decentralized. Decision making needs to happen where the knowledge is. And even better, if it can happen in a system that allows us to act as if we have more information than we actually do where we are at this time and place, we make even better decisions. Right? So it's not that he's suggesting that we all just live in this very small world where we only reflect on the knowledge that we have immediately in front of us. He says that the price system communicates, it conveys information. Prices are a bundle of information. I think some more modern economists have said prices are a bundle of information wrapped up in an incentive, right? So there are a lot of functions that prices serve, but he says it conveys information. The example he gives in his paper is about tin. I wish it was about copper or something else that would be more locally relevant here, but I think we can imagine his example of tin that, right, if we had a central planner that had all of the information about what was going on in the tin market, and with the availability of tin and the labor that's there to mine it and to refine it, I think it's bauxite, right, that makes tin. If we had someone that knew all about that, and something happened to the raw supply of bauxite, right, that it was reduced, we would want that central planner to say, okay, let's be more careful about how we use tin. Let's prioritize. Let's eliminate some of the lower priorities, look at some alternatives. But in reality, no one person has all of that information. But what's fascinating about prices, as even our introductory economics students know, is that when the supply of some raw material goes down, the price goes up. And that gives incentive to people to be very thoughtful about then how do they use that resource. Price goes up, quantity of money goes down. And so we act as if we knew there was something going on in the bauxite mines somewhere, right? 5 time zones away. I don't even know where they mine bauxite. I should probably figure that out. But maybe not, because I have the price system, right? I don't need to figure that out. I can look at the price of things that are made of tin or given to me in a tin can, right? And I can look at those prices and I can respond in a logical, rational sort of way. So prices convey information, but they also, as I said, give incentive for discovery of knowledge and information, and encourage us to expand our options. So if the price of tin goes up, self-interested people will think, ooh, how do I get in on that? How can I maybe provide an alternative to tin? I see this in energy as an example. I oftentimes tell my students that we shouldn't worry about draining our oil wells, because when the price of oil goes up, people start acting differently. Entrepreneurs look for other means of providing energy or making plastics with other inputs, right? People start consuming with different patterns. And so there's this discovery process that's incentivized by prices as well. And so a couple, I think, interesting quotes, again, maybe focusing on the blue pieces. I like this word marvel, right? That's another reason that I appreciate Hayek, is he causes me to step back and look at things I already knew. I understand supply and demand, right? But then step back and marvel at it and say kind of how wondrous it can be, right? That even the price mechanism brings these dispersed decisions, local knowledge together in a way that looks as if it's being coordinated, right? The price system acts as the coordinator, and so it's not just little decisions and little people and little families, but actually we have this cooperation, this coordination. Adam Smith would say, as if by an invisible hand, right? There's a marvel in that. And Hayek would go further to say, what is this invisible hand all about? Let's be clear that there's order in all of this that results from human action, but not from human design. And how fascinating is that we can get an orderly outcome without a single mind discerning what that outcome should be. That the system itself results in what he would call a spontaneous order. There's a lot more to be said there about spontaneous order, but I'll leave it at that for both local knowledge, the price system, and how marvelous it is in Hayek's estimation. We've got a third observation, but any thoughts, comments, questions thus far? Yes.
One of the things I do with my students is I tell them a story about how a university professor said that going to university is what you need to do because it is the best way to forward. And one other professor said, well, if that's true, why does my plumber make more money than I do?
Yes.
And I've done a test through the last 10 years of my students where I give them two options, an option as a desk job or an option as plumber. And the plumber makes 30% more than the desk job. And they will always choose the desk job over the plumber.
Sure.
And not only that, the women choose the man who has the desk job over the plumber.
Oh, that's very interesting.
So it's also sexual oriented too.
Yeah.
So,
interesting.
but and I've tried it, I've varied it quite a few times to see how much it is. There's a 50% premium of a desk job. I mean, people will be willing to work for minimum wage to get that desk job. So it's not always about price.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. But prices serve a function there in attracting people to maybe the dirtier, grittier, just tough job of being a plumber, right? You have to dig into old walls. And my husband was an electrician for a time. He did commercial industrial work, so he worked on the head of a nuclear reactor. You have to imagine there was a premium on the wage there. I remind him of that when he said, oh, I made so much money as an electrician. I would say, yeah, you were on a scaffolding 50 feet off the ground, working with electricity that if someone forgot to turn it off, your body would not exist anymore, right? There's actually electricity where you touch it and there wouldn't be, right? That's what labor economists call compensating wage differentials, right? And so the price mechanism does some pretty awesome things in attracting people to maybe what's less safe, less clean, maybe less socially revered kind of work. And then people get to choose looking at those prices. I
I would
think,
argue that that's not happening though.
okay,
So, because we know in Europe, for example, we have a very big housing problem.
okay,
We
yep,
cannot build the houses that we need.
yep,
And part of it is because there's just not the labor there. And
Interesting.
no
Yep.
no one wants to go in that way.
yep. No, we see that in the United States as well. I'm working on a project right now, what we call workforce development, because there are lines of work where we're having difficulty finding laborers to do certain jobs. And it's difficult as an economist to understand why that is. Why wouldn't businesses just increase the wage and attract people to the type of training that they need and to those particular lines of work? I have a couple theories on that. One is that, at least in the United States, and perhaps this is suggested even by kind of the premise of your question, the person who says you must go to university. In the United States, for 20 years, people have been saying you must go to university. No matter what, if you're going to have a worthwhile, fulfilling life, you must go to university. Parents say, if I love my child, I need to make sure they go to university. There's been this very strong cultural force towards a certain type of education for everyone. And I think that's problematic if we believe people have different, right? If we believe in comparative advantage and we believe in people have different abilities. Personally, I think it's problematic to set up a hierarchy of jobs and saying, you know, these are worthy jobs and these are lesser jobs. I don't believe that to be true. The other thing is, at least in the United States, that when a business says, I can't get qualified workers for this job, sometimes the government will say, oftentimes they'll say, well, let us pay for people to get the training they need so they can do that job. And the business says, oh, you want to pay for my workers to get trained and I get to pay them the same wage before? That's not a market mechanism. The market mechanism would say, well, to be a nurse practitioner, you need a certain amount of training, and that takes a couple of years of your life and some hard studying, and you have to pay your tuition. I better pay a nurse practitioner more so they'd be willing to do all that work. But as a business owner, it's easier for me if I can go lobby the government and say, why don't you make sure that there are just a plethora of people prepared for this job that would be willing to accept the wage that I wanted to pay them 10 years ago. So prices should work where they're allowed some space, but oftentimes our so-called market economies don't actually allow spaces and give the incentives to allow those prices to adjust.
Prices do not work in our country at the university education because we don't pay for education, so the students.
Right,
So it's for free, so prices cannot work.
That's a good point as well in the United States.
Everybody wants to go to university to study.
Yeah.
Comfortable.
Yeah.
University.
That's true. Even in the United States, it's not free, but it's highly subsidized. I think that would be a third factor. A fourth factor, I don't know how much you see this here, but there's some economic research on the idea of the lengthening of childhood. Do you find this? Maybe current generations kind of extending some of their more, maybe in the United States, even living at home, kind of relying, being dependent on parents. I think the research has suggested that is the result of general increases in wealth. That people, instead of having more children, are investing in longer, more comfortable childhood for their children. And I think sometimes, unfortunately, for those of us who are trying to teach people in university, that they think that that's one way to extend their childhood. Yeah, I've got to do some studying, but someone tells me what to do every day and when my homework is due, and it delays a little bit of going into adulthood. I even sometimes hear students say, I'm going to get a master's or a PhD because I'm not quite ready yet. And I think that's the worst reason to pursue additional education, is because you're feeling immature or not ready for adulthood. But I think that might be a fourth factor, at least in the US context. I don't know to what extent this is true internationally, but people used to have families at 15. And now we have trouble getting young men in the United States to get a job by the time they're 30. We've got a whole class of young men that would prefer to play video games than get a job. They're not unemployed because they're not looking for work. They're just out of the labor force. So the price mechanism in education is also, you're right, not at work. So I think it's an interesting thing if we believe that the price mechanism works where it's allowed to. When we see these persistent disequilibria or shortages or surpluses, that we look and say, where is the price mechanism being constrained or bound up or blocked from moving into a space that does attract resources to where they're desired and relatively scarce? Right? Why don't I have enough nurse practitioners to deal with the aging population? Why aren't nurses' wages going up? Oftentimes, again, healthcare not operating in a price system. Yeah, really good thoughts. Anything else? Right. This third contribution I wanted to share for the fact that it does make us, I think, stretch ourselves a bit beyond the economics, but so fascinating for understanding Hayek's view on the civilization that we exist within. He gets into later in his career, in particular, this idea of cultural evolution. It's not totally dissimilar from like biological evolution. It is the idea that the world we live in is the result of a lot of trial and error and kind of sticking with what works. But it's not quite survival of the fittest either, so let me be clear on kind of how he imagines this. First of all, he starts with this notion that there are two extreme ways of approaching human choice, in particular kind of this societal or, kind of cooperative or collective or communal way of decision making. So we would say one model would be to approach things from the perspective of instinct. So think back to kind of prehistoric small bands and tribes working day in, day out to provide food and shelter for their very small family or tribe, and think about how they did that. He would say this happens, right, just instinctively. It's an animalistic tendency. We still possess this, he says. We have feelings of altruism. We want to operate. There's something in us that wants us, we want to be altruistic to people, and he'll later tell us that that's appropriate within our families in kind of smaller settings, but it can lead us astray when we're no longer working within our tribe or our family and we're trying to engage in global trade. Altruism doesn't help us there so much. The other extreme would be to reflect on the fact that humans are created with this great gift of reason, and so why not use it? So let's reason ourselves to a better order of civilization. And so let's plan things very explicitly, looking at the institutions, for example, we have today, and making very deliberate improvements to those institutions in a reasoned fashion. He is not opposed to altruism, nor to reason, but he thinks of culture, and I think he appreciates it when culture is able to evolve through this kind of middle way, if we can call it that, where there is perpetual trial and error by individuals, by families, by small communities. Hey, I think it might work if, right, we tried this, let's see if it works. So he tells a story in one of his books I really enjoy, The Fatal Conceit. He tells the story of like the first family that stepped outside, the first man or woman who steps outside their tribe and said, I'm going to take this vial of oil to the neighboring tribe and see if they might like it, and maybe they'll have something that we would like. And how the family of that person must have looked at them and said, that's crazy. We need oil, right? Or wine or whatever it might be. Like, we like those things too. Why would you take it away from us? Right? So there was a real risk-taking there. And when someone tried it, then when it worked, they did more of it. And what we use to determine whether something worked is, where do we see abundance? Where do we see population growth? Where do we see decreasing child mortality? He would say that is a sign that something is working. And so where we've got abundance and the population thriving, the things that they're doing persist and become a larger component of our culture, and that shapes our civilization. And so he says what really defines and puts some something more concrete around these trials and errors and determining what works, is once something works well, it becomes codified, made more concrete in a set of traditions, what he'll call morals. I think he means that term differently than some ethicists, certainly theologians and the like. He really does, when he says morals, just mean traditions, rules that people take on and voluntarily submit themselves to. He even refers to that as law. He distinguishes between law and legislation. He says that we can have an evolution of law without a government saying this is the law. He certainly respects legislation and the importance of that, but he says laws can come about just by trial and error and us accepting them as social norms. And so he thinks, and I think this is really interesting in light of the fact that he's characterized as a big fan of freedom, is that actually rules are good. And when we submit ourselves to certain rules, right, like I'm going to trade this bottle of oil for this jug of wine, and I'm not going to clobber the guy over the head so that I can take them both home with me. I'm going to actually decide that that's not acceptable in exchange. When I submit myself to those rules, I might, in that situation, not benefit as much as I clobber the guy over the head and take everything. But on the whole, it's better if we set up a system and we accept these norms of enforcing contracts, right? Certainly supporting property rights, opposing murder and theft, and those sorts of things. Those rules actually allow us to live more freely, which I think is really a fascinating juxtaposition. Again, he sees all of this culture as resulting from human action, but not by human design. And that this is the story that brings about what he calls an extended order. So it's not just spontaneous order, but it's extended in that we no longer just operate within our tribes or our local communities. It's really this global network of exchanges. And I think kind of fascinating when we hear people talk about globalization. Do you ever get the impression that, especially I think non-economists think of globalization as like, it's like a thing, right? Like there's this globalization monster who's controlling globalization. In reality, globalization is when I go to the store and I see a blouse that I like and I buy it, and I don't even know that it was made in Bangladesh or Germany or wherever it might come from. I am, by human action, part of this system of so-called globalization because individuals are trading based on the things that they like and appreciate and value. And that's very much, I think, the result of an evolutionary process, not some person, certainly not some monster stepping aside and saying, oh, I think globalization, right? We'll do that. Let me make that happen. This is something that's been going on for some time in a somewhat natural way. And so this is kind of in the whole scope of, I guess, world history, when somewhat new, the extended order, right? Our natural instincts, our animalistic kind of primal instincts are to operate within the family and through altruism, but now we exist, even whether we like it or not, right, within this global network of exchange. And so he says the morality has to reflect that. That is, the rules that we submit ourselves to should reflect that. And so it's not that the extended order has replaced the intimate or local. He says, in, again, the book, The Fatal Conceit, that we must learn to live in two sorts of worlds at once. So he's certainly not suggesting that families operate as markets, right? That the way you get your kid out the door in the morning to school is to pay them the price it takes to, right, get them to put their shoes on and get going. Right, that's not the way we divide up household tasks within our families, to set prices and negotiate in that way. We have to learn to be comfortable with altruism within the family, even central planning within the family. Right? We're not using the price mechanism to figure out who does what. Someone says, right? Maybe I decide in my household what happens in terms of grocery shopping and the meals, and maybe my husband decides what the schedule for home repairs is. We have our own way of dividing things up, but it's certainly not a price mechanism that makes that happen. And so if we have this extended order, within which we have multiple families and smaller units. He actually refers to these as macrocosmos and microcosmos. He's just got a really interesting way with words. That each of us, perhaps within our family, then simultaneously exist in these two worlds, and we need two different sets of rules, two different ways of looking at our actions in those spheres. So families should behave altruistically. He's fine with that. He's not, cold-hearted price mechanisms everywhere type of person. Emotions work, right? We know something, right? Think back to local knowledge. We know something about our families. We don't need the price mechanism. I know the gifts and abilities and challenges and desires of my family members more than I do even my friend down the street, and certainly more than I do the person who's constructing the blouse that I decided to purchase at my local store. We have central plans, and he says have a very special function of transmitting morals and rules of behavior. So he sees the family as really serving an important function in the extended order. And if it's like, in this family we don't lie. We like to follow through with what we say we're going to do. We think integrity is important. We want to be honest. We keep our promises. All of those are really important morals or traditions that are important for exchange in the extended order. But where the extended order, where we're operating in that space, he would suggest that the rule of law and impartiality of imposing these rules and enforcing these rules is the most appropriate way for us to operate on the extended order. So an impersonal or impartial rule of law is going to work and again be the best for population growth or flourishing or population kind of thriving in his estimation. And again, it kind of brings us back to his first observation about local knowledge. It's really about acting based on what we know and then allowing prices and impartial set rules to function where we just don't know, right? When we don't have all the knowledge we might like. So each of those could, I think, be a discussion amongst, by themselves. But I did want to spend some time thinking about what this all means for today. Obviously, he's written these things a long time ago. I hope the way that I presented it makes clear that these aren't outmoded ways of thinking, that I think, whether we agree with them or not, they certainly, I think, belong in the debate, right? They're part of the conversation. And I think we can see that in terms of the work that's being done in our profession, within economics, within higher education in general, but also in terms of the social discourse, the sorts of things we see going on in the world around us, that Hayek has something to contribute here as well. So just to kind of tie this in together with some other areas of economics, I think the economics discipline, I would say in a lot of cases rightly so or understandably, is very focused on the technical work we can do, right? Kind of one of my favorite things about economics is that we've got these really great statistical tools that allow us to make causal inferences to say X causes Y. There aren't a lot of social sciences that really have a grasp on that. So I like that economists are very technically oriented. That's one of our areas of comparative advantage. Hope you agree. And so Hayek doesn't necessarily get into that statistical stuff, but how does he then have something to say here? Well, in the field of development economics, which I think is a prospering, flourishing field, we see a lot of graduate students in the United States going into development economics. One of the most well-known development economists, William Easterly, has drawn heavily on Hayek's ideas about local knowledge. He finds that inspiring of the sort of technical work that he wants to do. And in a moment, I want to say just a couple more words on development from a Hayekian perspective. Hayek was also inspirational to the new institutional economics school of thought, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't want to just say Hayek is an Austrian economist and only Austrians appreciate him. That's clearly not true. The new institutional economics, right, is this idea that institutions matter, that the context matters, including rule of law, property rights, and the like, that social norms matter. And Hayek had a significant influence in that well-known school or approach as well. Nobel laureate Vernon Smith, a number of years ago, gave a lecture to Parliament in Austria, and he thought it would be a nice time to give Hayek some credit for the work he was doing in experimental economics. And so he tells of how Hayek was very influential in this. I don't know if it's a burgeoning field anymore. I remember 20 years ago when I was in college not being familiar with it, but my undergraduate advisor saying, this is a really interesting thing going on in economics, that we can actually test some of these theories in a lab setting. And Vernon Smith has tested a number of things based on Hayek's thinking. So there's a lot of relevance here within other areas of quote-unquote mainstream economics. If I had to label myself, I'd probably call myself a neoclassical economist. I appreciate it a lot. Hayek is probably the member of the Austrian school that's most open to a neoclassical viewpoint, or just kind of the standard supply and demand kind of structure of things. And so I find that there's a lot of relevance here for me, even in my applied microeconomic research. He encourages us, I think, to remember the institutional context. Before I started doing this work with Hayek, I remarked to a gentleman who considers himself kind of a new institutional economist that I was enjoying reading some things, including by Hayek, because I got to think about property rights, and I kind of just quipped, oh, that's the thing we talk about in class for 10 minutes, the third day of Principles of Microeconomics. And he said, well, maybe you do, right? And I got the point that he spends days talking about property rights and institutions because of his viewpoint. And I took a step back and I said, oh, you're right. I probably should spend more than 10 minutes talking about property rights if I'm going to talk about market systems. And so Hayek has inspired me to think more carefully about how context matters and the institutions around us. And thereby challenges some of our assumptions. A lot of our neoclassical models have some pretty extreme assumptions, which I think is okay, right? If the model works, that's fine. But when the model doesn't work, we might take a step back and say, where are my assumptions leading me astray? What am I missing? I think his work also can inspire empirical research. There are people even today, especially I would say at George Mason University, and some folks that have done their graduate work there, that are testing some of his claims about spontaneous order and what's necessary in order to achieve spontaneous order. So there are plenty of people that are building on his work with technical economics. And I think his contributions too just point us to some of the basic principles and theory and perspectives of economic thinking in a time which I would characterize as being, our field in general, very, very productive, but sometimes losing sense of the larger economic way of thinking, right? We've got these amazing quasi-experimental methods that have been proven by these theoretical econometricians, and we have computing ability to do amazing things, and we've got people like Steve Levitt and the like who've written these books, right, for economics, and are doing these research that are based on data that's just really convenient, right? They set up these really interesting quasi-experiments, and so the data does this cool thing, so let's just let the data do the talking, and we forget that the theory and the reason behind it really matters as well. What does it all mean? And I'd say that even sometimes in experimental economics, people will run an experiment and then decide what it means. I personally find it really helpful to think about the theory, design an experiment or an empirical study that tests that theory, so that I don't just allow the data, right, to kind of shape my thinking. It should test. Right? If we're really a scientific discipline, I think we want to have these hypotheses that we can then test. And I think Hayek reminds us of that, right? That there's a lot we can do before we step to the data. I like that. I'm also interested in bringing Hayek into conversation with a lot of different spaces. As I mentioned, I think Yvonne actually mentioned as well that bringing him into conversation with some theological ideas is really fascinating just because I love making connections. I think it's just really fun to see things come together. I encourage my students to do that. But also, one of the innovations in economics over the last 50 years, I think due in large part to Gary Becker from the University of Chicago, is that we've extended the scope of economics to help us understand questions that used to be considered sociology or psychology or other areas of social science. And I think Hayek, right, he was kind of old school, technically, right? By definition, old school, by the, when he was learning and writing. It was a while ago, and economics was very much about business, right? Governmental interventions. It was pretty narrowly defined. I don't know if you noticed when Yvonne introduced me, I've done things on parenting, adolescent risky behavior, education choices, criminal justice reform. In fact, I think all of those would not necessarily be seen as within the scope of economics if it weren't for Gary Becker. But I don't think this is, something where now Hayek is outmoded because he didn't perceive or foresee that someone like Gary Becker would come along. I think, wow, what a great opportunity to see how his ideas about maybe living in two worlds at once, etc., are reflected in criminal activity or family decision-making or education choices. There's a lot of great stuff, and I think all of these things can come together. And then last, but certainly not least, right, the most recent Nobel Prize in Economics was given to Richard Thaler with this idea that nudging is the new hot thing to do. I think Hayek would have really big problems with that. And I think it's the sort of thing that is worth a discussion in our discipline. Not just that it's cool that Thaler and Sunstein and the like have put together these nifty ideas of how we can nudge and get people to make the right decisions, but to step back and maybe with the Hayekian perspective say who determines what the right decision is, right? We don't have all the preferences. How do we define that? What is our objective? Okay, you can get us to a particular objective. You can get people to eat more healthfully. You can get people to save more for retirement. But who decides that that's the right thing for each person? Hayek has a lot to say there, and this is almost, I think, at least in the U.S. kind of public sector setting, it's almost settled that nudging is a good thing. Nudging is the next thing, and I find that personally problematic. So I think Hayek has a lot to say. I wanted to say a little bit more about development. Oh, I should mention too, right? He's a fan of learning, broadly speaking. I also like that because I don't like to feel constrained to a certain area that someone says, here's what economists should do, or here are the things you should care about. I think he encourages us to explore broadly, but always with humility. He's very clear that human reason is limited, in part because of local knowledge, right? We just don't know everything. And from my own personal experience in graduate training, I don't know if you all have experienced this, humility is a lesson sometimes economists could learn too. We do some awesome work, and so sometimes we get pretty hung up on the really good stuff that we're able to do. But I did, as a shameless plug for the next thing we've got on our agenda today, suggest that there are some Hayekian undertones, I think, in Poverty, Inc., this film that we'll be showing shortly. And this is in the space of development economics. It's a very accessible film. It's a good one to send students to, and you might be able to access it on Netflix. If you're not able to make it today. It's a compelling film about what works for fighting poverty around the world. And I think economic development is an area where Hayek is very applicable, both in terms of international context, but also domestic poverty efforts. I think first and foremost, we want to recognize how important local knowledge is, and reflect again on his claim that knowledge is not the same as information. That data is not everything, that we need some perspective on that data. And I think he would say that authority needs to be located where the knowledge is held, right? You can't expect, for example, in an international setting, right, someone in Kenya to send us data, and then we in the developed world have this superior insight that allows us to just dictate what to do with that data and expect, right, our authority and our expertise is going to make this particularly good use of the information they've sent us. Just within the last couple of weeks, this report came out of the Brookings Institution, which is kind of center-left, but very mainstream think tank in Washington, D.C., and they do a lot of really great work on poverty. And I think this report moves in the right direction to some degree, but might make a misstep where Hayek's perspective is involved. You'll notice the article is entitled "Data is the New Feet on the Ground." And it tells the story of, right, back in the day, some decades ago, before there was very much ability to communicate quickly and precisely various data from the developing world, that the poverty alleviation efforts that were working or that people really had faith in were the ones that sent people, right? Sent people to be feet on the ground, to actually be there and kind of personal data collectors that then could send information and help with decision making, right? By developed world people for the developing world. And now this article says, hey, it's great, now we have technology, we can get this data from the developing world, and it's even that much easier to have feet on the ground just by virtue of data and communication abilities. I think that's problematic because information can be conveyed very nicely over satellites. I don't know that knowledge transfers quite as readily. Right, you really need feet on the ground, and I think Hayek would say preferably the feet of the people in the developing country, right? Not just people stepping from outside that context and coming in with some air of expertise, right? Remember the humility piece, but people that are actually in that context to reflect on what's going on. And so part of the solution, I think, to international poverty, but also in many cases domestic poverty, as well as to understand how institutions operate. And Hayek, right, really believes that institutions matter and the rules and norms that we follow are important. And so where many of my students, for example, think that fighting poverty is about getting food or clothing into the hands of the needy, right? And so therefore they should work for an NGO or some charitable organization actually doling out food and clothing. Sometimes I say, but you could become, right, a lawyer or an economist or someone in the political sphere that could actually work to change institutions, allowing people in developing countries to access the global marketplace. And that's a much more sustainable model of people feeding and clothing themselves, right? And it makes better use of local knowledge. We haven't, and this is the claim that the film Poverty Inc. will make, although the developed world has been pursuing foreign aid efforts for decades, we've never seen a country lifted out of poverty by this aid, right? We've seen economic growth lift people out of poverty. We see big improvements both in China and India, for example, that have caused international extreme poverty rates to plummet in amazing ways, but that's not because of loans or secondhand clothing or used eyeglasses being shipped, right, or excess rice from subsidized farms in the United States being sent to Haiti. That's not going to bring Haiti out of a situation of really broken institutions, political corruption, and the like. So I think Hayek has a lot to say there. Last thing I'll probably have time to say, I think these are debates that cross oceans and continents. Just for some visual interest, I've added some of the books that are really kind of hot in the United States right now in terms of the debate. There seems to be this notion that Western institutions are in decline. in part because of what we see happening in the political sector, right? What's happening in the United States in terms of the election of our current president. We see populism and those sorts of forces on the rise. I think that's probably true throughout many areas of Europe as well. And so people have written books. President Obama this summer said that on his summer reading list was this book, Why Liberalism Failed. So everyone's like buying this book now because President Obama's reading it. It really makes the claim that liberalism is inherently so flawed it was going to fail. Again, by liberalism, the author he tries to mean something like what Hayek would mean, but I think he's got an ill-defined notion of liberalism. Interesting book. I'm not sure I agree with it, but it really has started a debate. And that debate was answered in part by this book that I think the title actually might be a little more correct about the story going on here. Jonah Goldberg wrote this book, Suicide of the West, intentionally with that word suicide, because he says it's something that we're doing to ourselves, right? It's not that liberalism has failed. We've kind of killed off, I think he refers to it as the miracle of the West or something like that. This liberalization, the economic growth that we've experienced based on different rules and norms that we've taken on, we've consciously decided to leave those behind. And so it's more of a suicide rather than an unavoidable result in the way Deneen in his book kind of argues. So there's a really interesting debate here, and I think Hayek, oh man, I wish he was here to write a third book that contributed to this debate. It's something I'm hoping to do in the next couple months actually, is just write a little article, at least tying these together and hopefully finding a way through it that I think is a little bit more accurate, especially economically. Neither of these folks are economists, and that probably would help. But then there are other folks like Steven Pinker and Hans Rosling who are telling stories about, actually the world has some pretty amazing stuff going on right now, and this woe is me sort of downward glance of things are so tough now is not actually consistent with the data. That there are some pretty fascinating things going on, including the statistics that back up my claims about India and China. And extreme poverty rates around the world. And so I think Hayek might have something to say there as well. But in particular, in all of this, I think he would say, let's take a step back. And whatever we see happening in the political sphere, understand that that's an outcropping or growing out of what we see happening in culture. I've heard people say politics operates downstream of culture. And Hayek would say even more, ideas. It's something I haven't mentioned in my talk yet, but I think this is something the Austrians have in common, and certainly Hayek among them, to say that ideas really matter. And so the way we perceive the world around us and what we think the consequences of our actions, collective and individual, might be, those shape our culture. And it's our culture that brings about these political outcomes that we see. Hayek was very humble, so he didn't, right, his goal was not to step in directly into politics and make, use his human reason, like he didn't think he had some superior human reason to shift our institutions to avoid, in his case, World War II, right? Or later in his life, the path down the road to serfdom. He wasn't trying to actually change politics. He didn't think people could do that. We can't just step in and shift those systems and norms immediately. But what we can do is work to shape ideas in a way that has benefits for our culture through that evolutionary process, and that will have beneficial impacts on politics. So we have just a couple minutes, and so I'll say too that I think this is what really gives me motivation towards the questions of how morality and Hayek come together. Hayek came to his morality, his understanding of rules and tradition, not because he was a conservative. He wrote an article, also very interesting, Why I'm Not a Conservative, which is fascinating, because he actually really appreciates a lot of the institutions I was studying in Vienna. At that time, though not conservative, Mises and Hayek were really discouraged about this loss of this civilization, right? That they saw what was happening and that a lot of their ideas were being lost in the interwar period. They appreciated the existing institutions, even some of the less democratic sorts of political structures. They could see where they were providing some helpful, again, morals, understanding, rules that people were submitting themselves to. And so I think he would also say that in response to things like populism and other issues that we're experiencing in our world, that taking a look at morals is helpful. Now, he would say we don't always understand where our morals come from. And so he, even though himself not a religious man at all, that we know of, every time he wrote about it, he said, no, I'm agnostic, I can't believe in a God. He said, but religion is so useful. And not in the way like it's the opium of the masses. He didn't mean it like that. He said it's actually good that we have this way to impart rules and traditions that lead people to constrain themselves in ways that are really mutually beneficial so that we're actually more free, right? Life isn't nasty, brutish, and short because we have constrained ourselves. And so I think Hayek would say we need more of these family, cultural, even religious institutions. Like maybe we want to pursue those more instead of saying we've progressed so much we don't need those anymore, right? We can just do things as a conglomerate of the state. No, families are useful, church is useful, local institutions, clubs and organizations are useful. And at least in the United States, we see those things themselves, that portion of culture really in decline. People don't operate, they don't even know their neighbors, for example. That kind of cooperation is really valuable to the sort of civilization that Hayek appreciated. So I won't have time to talk about my research on Hayek and morality, but I hope that's okay with you. It's definitely okay with me because I wanted to share some of the big picture in hopes that there might be something there that you can grab onto and find a relevance to your work or to your students. In the last few minutes, if there are questions or comments, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Maybe, I'm sorry, just a small comment.
Sure.
Is that at our department we have, for example, a project that is focusing on economics of household.
Okay.
So thank you very much for this inspiration and this motivation.
Oh, great. Oh, that's so wonderful.
To continue in our research. And also at our department we have also another activity which is focusing on behavioral economics.
Okay.
So thank you very much for inspiring again.
Oh, good.
So, we are really like.
Oh, that's great. So you guys are really on the cutting edge of these different. I love to see economics just branching out. People refer to Gary Becker as an economic imperialist. If you ever look at my website, you might see that I use that terminology in describing some of the things I like. I know imperialism is a terrible word in many areas of the world, including our own context. But he said, well, if economic imperialist means that I think economics has something to say about a lot of different stuff, then yeah, that's what I am. And I think that's good. I think we should, with humility, step into anything. I mean, the family's important. Why shouldn't economists have something to contribute there too? Yeah, that's great.
I was looking at the website of Acton Institute,
Okay.
and I found that you have offered a course called Why Hayek Should Matter to Christians.
Yes.
Am I right?
Yes.
So you started to speak about the importance of church. So what do you teach at this course? What's the
Yeah. So let me give a plug if you're interested in, if that sort of thing sounds interesting, or if as you're perusing that website you see some of the other courses. The Acton Institute, who I'm working for as a research fellow this year, they have this fantastic 4-day conference in June in Michigan, which is beautiful in June, oftentimes with scholarships. available for people to come, what they call Acton University, and that's where I've taught that course. I share some more of just the general observations, like the first three I gave you, to give some basic literacy on what Hayek does, what he has done, what he has to offer. But then I talk about what he has to say about the role of the state and how I think that is consistent with, that's actually, I was going to show you this here's a list of actually other moral systems and other ways of thinking about local action that have nothing to do with Hayek that I think are congruent. But I was going to show you a picture of these different theologians, and this is one of the things that I'm doing, is to see that they come from very different viewpoints. And some of the folks at Acton University, the students there, which I should say include actual students through faculty members and scholars and the like, would be familiar with one of these gentlemen, but not with Hayek. And so they know that Catholic social teaching has this very strong notion of subsidiarity, which is that things should be done at the most local level possible. And not just because that's what works, right, which is what Hayek would say, but because man is created, the human person is created to be developed towards, right, some objective that God has, imbued him with. And that if it's not done at the most local level, right, if the family so constrains and imposes itself on the human person that they can't develop into their own human person, then the system is really fighting against what the human person is for. Likewise, if the state constrains the family so much that the family can't develop in the way it's supposed to, then that's against right, what Catholic social teaching would say is really God's intended order. And so at Acton University, folks would be familiar with that if they were Catholic or had studied some Catholic social teaching. In Western Michigan, where I am, this other gentleman is well known. He's a neo-Calvinist in the lines of John Calvin, a theologian from the Netherlands. My college, Hope College, is in Holland, Michigan. So you can guess it was founded by a lot of Dutch people, and there are still a lot of Dutch people. And so they really appreciate him, and so they'd be familiar with his idea of sphere sovereignty. And what he said was there are different spheres in society, and they are each sovereign. Now he would say that they get to make their decisions, they should be making decisions within their sphere because that's the way God intended it, right? Which, as a Christian myself, I believe God has intentions and has had design, but as an economist, I'm like, ooh, I want more, right? I want to dig into that more, and so I see that this man has said spheres, right? Education has its own sphere, church has its own sphere, health sector, business, and the church shouldn't step into education and say, this is how you do education right. The church shouldn't step into business and say, this is how you do business right. Neither should any of the other spheres, right? Impede each other or usurp each other's sovereignty. But I think, wow, why is this? If it's true, if we buy that God intended it this way, maybe it's because really educators are most prepared and best suited for deciding what works for education because of local knowledge. And maybe businessmen and women are able to make the decisions in their sphere best because local knowledge. And so I see that these things are woven together. In terms of motivating why Christians should care, though, oftentimes with my students, with people in my community, I talk about poverty. And even just the basic ideas that good intentions don't always result in good outcomes. And I think Hayek tells us that, in particular with his understanding that mankind is limited in our reasoning abilities in terms of our goodness, even though he's not a religious or particularly, Ray doesn't have this very obvious system of ethics other than kind of what works. He says that man is not good. Naturally, we're limited in our goodness, we're limited in our reasoning abilities, and so when it comes to fighting poverty, what we shouldn't do is step in and communicate to the materially poor, you're inferior, I'm superior, let me do you, without any expectation that you'll ever be able to provide something yourself. That all of that kind of standard model of poverty alleviation, which I think a lot of Christian people and organizations pursue really good-naturedly, right? My church packs boxes of stuff to send to poor people. That's problematic in what it communicates to the materially poor about their own value. And also, so it can actually be harmful to them. And it's harmful to us if we go through life thinking that we always have the answers for everyone else. So I try to leave that message out of that course as well, that how we think about poverty should reflect our limited nature as human beings. We can do awesome things, but we're not perfect.
This wonderful statement. I would try not to be rude, but I will have to end this
Oh, I
discussion.
kept you 5 minutes long. Anyways, I apologize.
We are very tight on the schedule. We have another activity going on with our students. You were invited for this activity. It's a screening of the movie Poverty Incorporated. And I want to thank you, Sarah, for your wonderful contribution. I want to thank you all that you made your way here, and you were part of this discussion. And Sarah is still here in Banska Bystrica for today. She's leaving tomorrow. She has 2 hours spare time from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, so you can steal her time if she agrees.
Yes.
If you are interested in more discussion, just write me email or book me SMS and I can contact you. So for now, thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.
I hope that this is not last contribution or not last speech, and maybe it will bring some cooperation between our institutions.
Fantastic.